Hey everyone, I hope you're doing really well. So when I first started drawing with coloured pencil, I really struggled to get enough depth in my pencil work, and one of the things that I really used to struggle with when it came to animal portraits were eyes and noses. So obviously my last free masterclass we did a horse's eye, so I thought today we'll switch it up and we do a dog's nose. So the photo that we've got here is super contrasted. We've got a lot of darks going on, we've got a lot of lights going on, and I'm going to show you exactly how to create this super realistic effect with lots of detail, but also really incorporating enough depth so we can really make this piece pop. So I'm working on the Hahnemuhle hot press watercolour paper. The full material list and downloadable materials guide, line art reference photo is all in the description box, so go and give it a download if you want to follow along. And yeah, this shouldn't be too much of a stressful class, or not, I say stressful, it shouldn't be too much of a lengthy class, but as always I will break it down and make it as simple to follow as possible, and I really hope you enjoy it and learn a lot from this, or at least something along the way. So as always, I'm going to be keeping a scrap bit of paper just underneath my hand. This just stops the oils from transferring from my hand onto the bit of paper and just keeps everything, in my opinion, a little bit neater. So when I approach anything like this, I'm always initially looking to make sure my darks are dark enough. I'm looking to block in some of those darkest contours, and this will help me establish my values a lot easier. And what I mean by that is it will help me figure out how light I need to make my light areas. Sometimes if we go in with light areas first, we can automatically make them too dark without really realising, and if we don't get enough contrast between our light and our dark areas, that's what can make our drawings look a little bit flatter. So I'm going to start off by just mapping out some of these darker areas. I'm initially going to go in with the polychromos black, so just gently, and I don't want to press too hard for any of this because I want the ability to be able to manipulate my pencil a little bit and blend it into those lighter areas, because one thing that whenever we're drawing anything like this or any sort of animal portraiture, there's never any harsh lines, there's never any sharp lines. So with the nose, we're going for the light area and it's almost like on a curve, so we're curving it into the darker bits. So what we need to be doing is really making sure that we're using a light pressure, because if we press too hard, we get a harsh line going through here. It's going to be difficult to create that natural gradient of colour going into the lighter bits. So as I said, we're just going to use a very light pressure to just establish this darker section. I'm following all of those darker bits. So we've obviously got a lot of shadow and a lot of contrast over one side of the nose here. So again, looking just to block in some of those darker shapes. It's the main sort of bit, one of the main pieces of advice that I have for drawing anything realistic is try and forget what you're actually drawing and just draw in initially the shapes you can see. Another pencil I'm going to use again just to help me establish the depth a little bit more is going to be some of the darkest sepia from the Luminance. So this is the 407, and I'm just going to just gently go over the darker areas where we can see it sort of transitions a little bit into more of a brown, dark, very dark brown hue. And the reason why I love, well, first of all, I just love using the luminants anyway, just purely because they're quite smooth and buttery and they're quite easy to sort of blend. So I'm just focusing on any of those a little bit of a darker sort of very brown areas. Now the reason again why I would opt for using this over the dark sepia from the Polychromos is because this has got a slightly warmer brown hue to it. The black from the Polychromos can sometimes look a little bit flat, so the dark sepia from the Polychromos can sometimes look a little bit flat. So again, we're just going to just gently, I'm not going too far into any of those lighter areas, but I'm just trying to establish a little bit of this darker shapes and contours. And the beauty of working on this Hahnemuller surface over a lot of the other hot press watercolour papers is it's quite smooth, which I know arguably is going to create a little bit of an issue if you're used to working on something like hot Fabriano or any of this slightly more textured watercolour papers. But where this is quite smooth, we don't really, like, it's quite easy to kind of create a smooth layer. And I know some of us do struggle to get enough depth to this paper, but in my opinion it all comes down to colour theory, and if you can kind of manipulate your colours well enough, this paper is by far one of my favourites now. I much prefer it over the Fabriano that I used to absolutely love, and if anything it is super inexpensive in comparison. So again, just going to just gently come over that darker line as we go up here a little bit more. Again, only using the lightest of pressures. And like small circular motions as well, just to really make sure we've got a nice smooth layer. So just working, as I said, with the darkest sepia into some of these sort of more deep brown shapes, and almost like creating the start of that contour, the start of that curve, being very careful you don't go too far into those lighter areas that we can see where the highlights are, but we can kind of just work this around. Again, just using a very light pressure. I'm just going to pick back up with my black and just lightly just sketch down the front of the nose. Now again, really don't want to press too heavy for this little line we've got going on down here. So I want to keep it quite light and loose. And again, back in with the darkest sepia, just around. So we're just trying to build up a little bit of the contrast at the moment. Again, you can see that I'm not pressing too hard. I'm keeping quite a lot of texture to the nose and to the paper at the moment, and this will allow me to manipulate my colours a little bit easier. So again, just continuing to block in some of those darker bits. I'm kind of just trying to leave out any areas where I can see there's a little bit of a lighter colour. I'm beginning to kind of go back in and press a little bit harder when I've got a bit more confidence as to how dark to make those transitions. So I've just given the sepia a little bit of a sharpen, and this is just going to help me kind of go in a little bit and refine the slightly darker areas. So when we're working with slightly blunter pencil, we tend to get more of a sort of textured effect, because obviously our pencil isn't sharp enough to completely smooth the tooth of the paper, and unless we obviously press a little bit harder. Now throughout this whole thing, I'm always going to want to be keeping my pressure nice and light, because with this paper it can take a lot of layers, but we do want to keep our pressure on the lighter side. So if you want to kind of establish a little bit more depth without putting any more pressure down, just give your pencil a sharpen. And again, don't want to press too hard over the edge, well, over the top bit here, but again, just trying to go in with a slightly sharper pencil just to establish a little bit more of the structure and the depth. We can also use, I'm going to stick with the sepias, but I'm going to just take a little bit of the sepia 10%. Now, one thing I would suggest is when we're working into these slightly lighter areas, I will be removing the line art for some of this. And again, just pressing very lightly again. So when I say lightly, I mean it, you can see I'm not even indenting my in my sort of like flesh there. I'm just trying to keep my pencil so light and really just very smooth in our layering. And we can kind of just layer over. Some of that line art again. We will be, as we work towards those lighter areas, we will be just removing some of it, but I like to use small circular motions. Not only does this help me create an even layer, but it also helps just create almost like a little bit of texture to the nose, even at this early point as well. So before we do any erasing, I'm just going to continue to build up these edges with the darkest sepia, again where I can see it's super dark, but I'm always just using very light pressure. And this is gonna, by using a really light pressure, it's gonna help me, just as I keep saying, blend into the lighter areas. And obviously we've got fur coming out the nose, but I'm not going to include that right now. So to remove some of these little graphite line art bits, the line work I should say, I'm just going to use the Monotombow eraser, and I'm removing this bit by bit. I don't want to take away too much because I don't want to get lost. And then I'm just going to go back in very gently and lightly with the sepia 10%. And what I should mention at this point is, obviously if we're looking at the reference photo, this area down here we've got, you can see there's a lot of like browns and purples. Throughout the whole nose there's actually quite a lot of browns and purples, and that's why I'm opting for the sepias, because they're much warmer to really create the contrast. If you look into these lighter reflection areas, or the bits where there's a little bit of shine, to really make them pop, we can use some cooler tones to really bring in a bit more of a blue, and the blue against the browns will just contrast it so nicely. So again, focusing just on the warmer bits at the moment, and just using a very small, sort of tiny light circular pencil stroke with the sepia 10% to gently build this up. I'm not going to remove all of the line art. I only really tend to remove the line art in the areas where I know it will show through, so we won't be going over it with a darker pencil, because that's where the line art will become visible, and it can sometimes make our work look a little bit muddy. So again, just going to use a very light pressure after removing it of the sepia 10%. And this is again just trying to help me establish where those sort of slightly lighter areas go, and by working with this really light pressure and sort of like pushing our pencils into each other and layering over the top, it's going to allow us to create that smooth gradient effect. So again, just focusing on the mid-tones at the moment, and then over the top to really start to build up a little bit more of those darker mid-tones, you'd use the sepia at 50%. Again, the luminance, a sepia 50%. I'm using the luminance a lot for this. And there's multiple reasons why. First of all, as I said, the pencils glide together and blend together so beautifully, and they're just I love the colour range of these. But as well as that, we can use the slice tool over the top to really create and build up a little bit of contrast. So again, just using a light pressure, going into over the top where we put the sepia at 10%. This is exactly how to create these really nice, beautiful, light layers. And then we're just going to focus back in on some of those lighter mid-tones. I'm not going over any of those really light, shiny areas. I'm just focusing on the outer side or the outskirts of those bits. And again, this is just going to help me build up that soft, gradual transition. Filling in any areas that just need a little bit more depth to them. And just keep going back over these darker areas, just gently and gradually building them up. Really get lost in this. I find doing stuff like this so therapeutic. So for me, it doesn't matter if it takes a little bit longer by just, I mean, we could draw this a lot faster. We could go a lot heavier with our layers, but we won't get that gradual soft effect. I love doing pieces like this just as a form of just practice, but also I find it, as I said, super therapeutic. Just by being able to go over and just smooth out the layers one by one, I find it just, I don't know what it is, but it is just something about doing pieces like this that I find just so magical and just really lovely to sort of build up. And I think it's because I can kind of see it all coming together. And yeah, it just makes me happy. So just get lost in it and enjoy it for building it up and working on building up these contrasts and really pushing our values more and more with each layer. So again, just using the darkest sepia. What we could do as well at this point is take the Derwent Drawing Black, which is my favourite black of all time. It's super pigmented and super black, and then we're just going to just put in the nostrils. So where I know that it's super dark. And be careful, you notice that I'm only focusing this right in the centre. I'm being careful not to go too close to the edge. We've got a little bit of a gap around there, and I'll explain why in a minute. So I'm just going to continue and build this round to about there, I think, and exactly the same on this side as well. So just leaving about 1 millimetre or so of space. So the reason why I left that space there is because we're just going to use a mixture of the polychromos black, which isn't as dark as the Derwent drawing black, and I'm just going to use a very light pressure, and I'm just going to blend it in towards where we've put that darkest sepia, and again just using a very light pressure, and I'm just going to layer over the top as well with the darkest sepia, because basically, like what I said right at the beginning, we want to create that really gradual contrast and that gradual sort of like curvature to this bit here. So we don't want there to really be any harsh lines. There will be some areas where, like through here, where we've got this lighter bit where we can afford to have a little bit of a sharper line, but for the most part we want it to look like it's gradually faded. And sometimes, as I said, by using such a pigmented pencil like the Derwent drawing black, it can just make our lines look a little bit too harsh, which is why I will always kind of stop a millimetre or so away from the edge of that dark area and just blend the rest out with some of the sepia and the polychromos black. You can't actually see that edge, so why would we put it in? It wouldn't make any sense to do that. So again, just gonna build and blend with the polychromos black and the sepia. We might end up just darkening and going over a little bit more with the Derwent drawing black. Just small circular motions and a light pressure just to kind of build up the depth. But we're just doing it very gradually. And just coming away and using some more of the darkest sepia to help us start to build up a little bit more of the depth to the nose, to these darker areas. So sometimes it's when we put in those darker parts that we start to realise how dark we need to make the surrounding bits. And then again, we're just going to take the black just from the polychromos and just blending it outwards. But again, just go easy on this, because again, it looks a little bit strange at the moment because we need to continue to build up some more of the darker bits. So at the top of the nose here, again, you can definitely see there's a little bit more of a purpley kind of cooler hue throughout some of it. There is a lot of warmth, but we have got a little bit more of that purpley hue just in the middle bits where you can see there's a bit of the contour and the lightness. So again, just going to use some of the sepia 50% just to gently help us carve out that nose. Then going in with some of the darkest sepia. Trying to blend out that darker line on the outside as well. We're just going to take a little bit more of this sepia at 10%, and I'm just going to run a little bit of the cold grey 4 from the polychromos just into that bit as well, just to help us create a bit more of that cooler tone. It's very, very subtle. If it's not going sort of blue enough, I'm also going to take some of the Payne's Grey 30% and just gently running this, layering it through the slightly lighter areas in the centre of the nose, and we will just sort of, it might look a little bit flat at the moment, but again we can go back in with some of the darkest sepia to carve out some of that detail once again. Another brilliant colour that you could use for this to really help elevate that contrast is some of the dark indigo from the Luminance. Now this, you just place this in very, very gradually and carefully into any areas that you want to be a little bit sort of darker and cooler, because it's super, super pigmented. So I'm only using this very, very gently and lightly just to help build up a little bit more of the depth to any areas that have got a slightly cooler finish, or to help us build a bit more of the contrast, because again this is very, very dark blue, but it works beautifully to create more depth to those darker areas. And we're going to do exactly the same around this side with the black polychromos and the sepia. So just lightly sort of taking the black polychromos, just blending it over that edge where we've left that little bit of gap, and again just using the sepia, darker sepia, just to help with the blend. And then again just going over to blend it out once more with the black polychromos, just gently building up that transition. And then again we're just going to take more of the black, just all I'm doing is using tiny little pencil strokes here just to almost like feather out As you can see, there's a little bit of detail coming in. So we're not going too heavy on that, but we're just trying to kind of create that curvature to the nose. And as we start working up and into those slightly lighter areas, I'm just going to drop my pencil down a shade and go in with the 50% sepia. And I'm also, you know, you can just, it's not brilliant to do because it's not as good as pastel matte for keeping it, for working light over dark, but if you use the sharpest part of your pencil, which I know sounds ridiculous, but if you look closely at your pencil, you'll see that one side of the tip will be a little bit sharper than the other. So if you work with that sharpest side, you can kind of just go over the darker bits a little bit, and just smooth them down and kind of create a little bit of lightness to those bits. And this is the other beauty of not sort of working too heavy with our pressure at any one point, because again it just means we can kind of keep going in and layering with different shades, and then again darkening with some of the sepia, the darkest sepia, trying to again keep some of that lightness showing through. And then we are just going to start to use again a little bit more of the black. This is just a polychromos black, and I'm just gently layering this over some of those darker areas. Again, just going back in with the darkest sepia and a smooth circular motion just to build up the depth. I'm also just going to use a little bit of the Payne's Grey 30% just into any areas that I can see have got a slightly cooler tone. So it's mostly these lighter bits. You can kind of see it's got a purpley kind of slightly blue hue. So I'm just going to lightly layer this throughout those areas as well. Again, just keep my pencil stroke super light. And then we've almost got like this little bit of like a brown hue going on down here. So again, we kind of want a bit of a reddy kind of purpley feel to this. So I think I'm just going to take a light layer of the sepia 50%. Just, as I said, lightly layering it in. And going over some of those darker bits with the sepia, the darkest sepia. Again, only pressing very lightly. And you can just trying to sort of work out what colours to use. You could take maybe like a little bit of Caput Mortem from the Polychromos, just again bringing in a little bit of that reddy kind of hue. This is very, very gentle and subtle, but again, it's just, I call them hidden colours because they're very, very subtle, but they make so much difference to the overall appearance. So again, just going to continue just to build up through these sort of brighter browny kind of darker areas. Just again using a light pressure of the sepias, just blending into that darker bit at the back. And then again, just going to take some of the Caput Mortem. And another colour you could use to really help build up this depth, and I love this colour so much, but only use it very, very sparingly because it's super pigmented, but it is from the Lightfast range, and even if you don't get any other of the Lightfast pencils, I would highly recommend picking up this one. It is the Mars Black, which is a very deep reddy brown, and it just works so well to build up depth and contrast those sort of deeper reds. So again, just taking a very, very light pressure of this and just using it to help us create a little bit more depth to those areas. And then again, we're just going to take a little bit more of the sepia, darkest sepia. And you can really build up the contrast here, building in a little bit of the contour and the darker areas by using, again, a bit of the dark indigo. And this is just going to work so nicely against the red, just to help elevate, bring in a little bit of that cooler tone, and create a bit more of the structure. So I really like to kind of blend out the nose contour, the nostrils, and add a little bit of this in, which is just going to help us create that deep reddy hue. You might find you need to just go in as well with a bit more of the dark sepia just to balance that out a bit. So you're creating a little bit more of those darker lines. And then we're just going to take more of this sepia 50% and just going into some of these slightly lighter areas. Again, not pressing too hard, but just trying to build up the structure and following the little bits of line detail that we can see. We've still got so much scope here for sort of darkening. So again, just building over the top with some of the darker sepia. Just using a very light circular motion just to help. This is naturally going to create a bit of texture. and over the top as well. Maybe just, no, that's not gonna work. I would recommend just continuing just to use a little bit of the dark indigo, but again, just use this so gradually and carefully to help build up the deeper, sort of cooler depths. And this helps contrast and build up. You know, when people say they struggle with the smoother surface because they can't get enough depth, it's not about adding more pencil or a heavier pressure, it's about knowing how to manipulate your colours. So again, just using colour theory and really putting contrasting deep colours down to help elevate and create the depth that we need. And then again, just building up more the contrast down the centre of the nose here with, again, the black. I'm just using polychromos black at the moment and just sort of drawing in some of the shapes. So just using a light pressure just to sort of blend out that line a bit. And then again, we're just going to take the sepia, the darker sepia, just pressing a little bit harder than we have done, just to again build up a bit more of the contrast. Now we know how that we need to make it a little bit darker. And again, on this side, not pressing that much harder, but just working in a much more controlled pencil stroke just to help fill in the tooth of the paper a little bit more. Just going to take a little bit more of the black and just again building up the contrast. And adding a bit more depth to these darker bits. And once we've got those in, then we can just go over the top with the dough and drawing black straight up the centre there. Again, not pressing too hard because we don't want to create too harsh of a dark line. Just a little bit. And then we can just go in with the black and from the polychromos and the sepia, darker sepia, to help build up the contrast again away from that dark line. Okay, so continuing with the sepia, darker sepia, and we're just going to press a little bit harder and build up these darker areas again. and pressing slightly lighter, obviously just to darken certain other areas. If all of a sudden there is some snoring, I have got my boyfriend's bulldog who is currently under the desk, and he is laying on his side and he is sound asleep, and I reckon within 5 minutes he'll be snoring his head off. So, and he is loud when he gets going, so it gives us something to sort of laugh about, but if it gets a little bit too much I'll try and remove him. I've never known an animal make as strange noise as a bulldog. If you know me, you'll know that I have Charlie, who is my working Cocker Spaniel, and he is just the sweetest, most funny, genuine, lovely little loyal dog. And Pablo is also really lovely, but some of those noises are questionable. He sounds like a piglet, he is really cute though. So, okay, so as you can see, I'm just slowly just building up more and more into these sort of slightly darker areas. Just trying to sort of follow the shapes that we can see. Obviously this is sort of a bit of a halfway house. We're not going in with anything massively dark at the moment, but that said, I do think I'm going to start to take a little bit more of the black, and I'm just going to, this is a black polychromos, and I'm just going to start to build a little bit more into those darker areas. Really starting to build and work on those darkest little contours. Honestly, if you can hear that, he sounds like a pig. He's just snorting away. What's up, Pebs? He's giving himself an ear lick, a little ear bath. Charlie's so quiet in comparison. So again, just continuing building up into these slightly darker areas. Just trying to sort of mimic the shapes that we can see in the reference photo. I also think I might just use a little bit of the Payne's Grey 60% just into these slightly darker, cooler, blue toned areas. So again, around this shiny bit here, just using that as a bit of a base layer over the top, over the sepia 10% that we've put down, just to make it a little bit cooler toned. And then I'm just going to go back in with some of the sepia 50%, just really lightly start to map out some of those darker sort of mid-tone shadows. So focusing on the darker shapes that we can see and just trying to lightly block them in. Now it does look a little bit on the cooler side at the top here. So I think I'm gonna mix some sort of blue shades in. Now don't worry that obviously it looks like we are going completely over where some of those lightest areas are, but don't worry about that at the moment, because the beauty of using the luminance pencils is that we have got the ability to go in with the slice tool, and the slice tool will just help us lift off a little bit of the pigment and allow some more of the detail to sort of show through, or we can create light detail with the slice tool, which I'll show you a bit later on. I'm just going to use again some of the 10% sepia just into those slightly lighter areas. So light pressure and the sepia 10%. And again, I'm just going to use a little bit of the Paint Grey 30% over the top, just to bring in more of that cooler shade. I'm not pressing too hard, just trying to keep everything really light. Just putting enough pigment down just to cover the paper. I like to keep my pencils quite sharp for sort of thinking about adding little bits of detail. I'm not going to go too overboard with this now, but I'm just using a little bit of the sepia, darker sepia, just to, again, just slowly and gently start to look at mapping out some of these darker sort of shapes. Just coming around the sort of where this dark shadow line sits for the sort of like the contour of the nostril. So again, we can kind of see these light little hairs, but I'm not focusing on those light areas at the moment, which I know is possibly a little bit counterproductive, or not counterproductive is the wrong terminology, but obviously when we're working with coloured pencils, we're always aiming to work from light to dark. So I know this might seem a little bit strange, but this is where we've just got to trust the process. And then I'm just going to use a very light pressure of the sepia at 10% just over the edge, just to again start blending into these slightly darker areas. Again, just leaving out where I can see there's going to be that those lighter bits, and I'm just going to glaze over where we've put the dark sepia with a little bit of the, not the dark sepia, the sepia 10% with a bit of Paint Grey 30. And then we are just going to start to go over and layer in a little bit more of the sepia 50%. But again, just using such a light, gentle pressure, just using circular motions to build up into these darker bits. Just using a very light pressure and sort of just blending out those top parts. Again, not focusing too much on the lighter bits. Now you can see right on the edge over here, we've got a little bit more of a browny, yellowy kind of area. So I'm just going to lightly place that in with a bit of the burnt umber from the polychromos. Just really gently layering this over that edge and maybe a little bit into the side here. And also adding a bit through there. So I'm just glazing over the top into any part, so I can see I've got a little bit more of a yellowy brown hue. And then we're just going to take the black again from the polychromos and just lightly and gently building up. And then again, just keep layering in between, well, going back in over backwards and forwards with the sepia, darker sepia and the black. So I'm just going to remove the last sort of like little bits of graphite from the really inner shiny areas. Maybe a bit up here as well. And then through that top bit, I'm just going to use a bit more of the sepia 10% just to bring in that little bit of that transition between the nose and the fur. You can see it's just a touch darker. Again, just working very, very lightly, sort of up and down in the direction of the fur, just so we, again, don't get any harsh lines. And then we are just going to use the sepia, the darkest, no it's not, sorry, not the darkest, but the sepia 50%. And again, just running it over the top, just to blend out that top edge. And then we're just again going to focus on adding a little bit more depth and bring in the sepia, the darkest sepia, just to block in lightly. And I'm only using very, very delicate pressure, or delicate pencil strokes, not pressure, but to just build up a little bit of the contrast and the darker areas, just using almost tiny little pencil strokes to just give the illusion of a bit of texture. Okay, so in these super light bits, I'm going to just use a little bit of the Caran d'Ache white and just glazing that in. Just place it in gently. And maybe a little bit through here and insert this really bright area here. But as we get over towards this area, it's still light, but it's got more of a cooler blue hue to it. So what I'm going to do is continue to add a little bit of the white, but I'm also going to just glaze lightly over the top with a little bit of silver grey from the luminance, which is this really beautiful, very light blue shade. Putting all of that in, and then we are going to use a little bit more of the sepia, 50%, and starting to just look at building up some more of the texture. So again, just using small circling motions. The thing is, like, obviously there's a lot of detail in this reference photo, and it's really not massively all too important to get absolutely everything in when we're drawing. The main thing that makes something look realistic is the amount of depth that we get, which is why it's so important to make sure your darks are dark and your lights light, and the rest of it, I'm not saying it's not important, because obviously it is important to try and get these values in correctly, but a bit of detail, but it's not overly important. So again, we're just going to take the sepia 50%. I'm just going to carry on sort of drawing in some of these sort of small circular motions, obviously using a lighter pressure as we head in towards those light areas, trying to leave a bit of the colour, the silver grey and white from underneath showing through. And then we're just also going to maybe use just a little bit of the Payne's Grey 30%, just to help blend and build in a little bit more of this cooler blue hue, glazing that over the top. And just giving the sepia 50% a sharpen. We're just going to draw in some sort of really like scribbles. Just to bring in a little bit more of that texture to the nose.
And again, just glazing more depth down here. And then I'm also going to just use a bit of the polychromos black. There you go. It's a little snorty snore from the bulldog. So you see where we can left this little bit of lightness, this bit that's a bit darker, we left it light over here. So I'm just going to put that in, and it's got a little bit of like a cool tone at the end. So we're just going to use a bit of the Payne's Grey. This is just the Payne's Grey 60%. And again, just blending more of the black. And again, some of the darker sepia, just to build up the contrast a bit more. Just mapping in some of these darker shapes. And obviously there's lighter fur coming off here, but we're only focusing on the nose for this. So again, just pressing a little bit harder to block in some of those darker areas. And we're just going to take a bit more of the black again and just running it over those darkest areas. Again, not pressing too heavy or too hard for this, we're just trying to build up a little bit more of the contrast. Again, just drawing over those darkest areas, not pressing too hard, but just to build up a little bit more of the contrast, as I keep saying. Again, just building up the depth around the underside of the nose or the nostril. And I'm going to blend out so you can kind of see a bit of the transition. It sort of goes the dark into the light a bit. So I'm going to use the darkest sepia to help with this. And again, just drawing in a little bit of the detail into these bits just to help darken them up with the darkest sepia. Then again, we're just going to take a sharp, oh my goodness, I cannot speak, the darkest sepia from the luminance again, and just give it a really good sharpen. So again, it is nice and sharp, and then we're just going to go over and start to just build in a little bit more of the detail and working on those contrasts just a tiny bit more. I'm really trying to focus on pulling out the dark details. So, you know, I said at the beginning about creating the curvature. So what we're trying to do by adding some sort of dark areas within the lighter bits. And focusing more pressure as we head into those darker parts as well. So really trying to, as I keep saying, focusing on building up these darker areas and sort of just blending. Another pencil that you could use to add a little bit of depth is the black from the luminance. Now, I know you're probably thinking, okay, well, we've used 3 different blacks so far, like why are we using so many different ones? So the reason why I would always try and opt to go in with something like this black over the polychromos black is because it's a wax-based pencil. And the polychromos is an oil-based pencil. So for adding bits of detail, don't get me wrong, the polychromos pencils are incredible for detail. However, they come at, when we're working on a hot press watercolour paper like this one, where we're going to be wanting to probably go in with a slice tool to remove, it's really, really difficult to remove areas when, well, it's literally impossible to remove areas with the slice tool on if we just use the polychromos, whereas if we use the luminance where they're wax, it's like almost like slices off the wax. So it's a really effective way of creating bits of detail. Now this black has almost got a little bit of a cooler hue to it than the other blacks that we use, and this can actually work in our favour when kind of creating the darker bits of detail on the nose here, because essentially in the reference photo, as I've sort of gone through with you, it has got quite a lot of warm and cooler areas, and there's actually quite a lot of like that cooler blue hue. So this can actually work really, really nicely to help us build up a little bit more of that sort of cooler contrast. So it doesn't matter if you don't have that much sort of white or lighter area showing through. So I'm using this a little bit over some of those super dark areas as well. Just again because it's where it's got that sort of slightly a little bit cooler hue to it. Work really nicely for blending, building up the cooler shades. And adding a little bit more contrast in. And then what we can do from here to really help us again build up the depth and contrast is just going over those darkest areas, so like the nostrils, and sort of flicking out the pencil a little bit just to create a smoother transition with the Derwent Drawing Black. Focusing a little bit on the on any of those super dark areas and the shadows. Using a light pressure as we sort of come away from those dark bits, and almost like drawing upwards as well, just to fan out any of that darker detail to create that smooth contrast. And then again, just taking more of the darkest sepia from the polychromos, from the luminance, and just building up more of the depth. And as well as that, I'm just going to look at using a bit of the Caput Mortem, just bringing that red, that pinky red hue. So glazing this very lightly over any areas that have got a bit more of that pinkiness, like that reddy feel to them. Again, these are just like hidden, like, say they're hidden colours, but they're almost like things that you could overlook, but they make such a difference. Exactly the same as going in with some more of the the Caran d'Ache Luminance Dark Indigo, which again you can use and it makes such a difference. Just helps pull out those shadows and adds so much depth. Also, you can absolutely use a bit more of the burnt umber just into any of those lighter sort of brown areas. Just lightly glazing over. And again, just using a little bit more of the dark indigo just to help build up the contrast and the depth into these cooler areas. And again, I cannot emphasize it enough, but just go so carefully with this pencil because it is so pigmented. Okay, so now to go in and kind of refine some of the detail. First of all, what we can do is just go in with a little bit of the, this is just a silver grey from the Luminance, and I'm just going to just gently sort of build up and draw over some of those lightest areas. And this is also going to help just taking this over any of those kind of blue hued parts as well. And this, as I said, it's just going to bring in a little bit more of that cooler part. So we just do this very, very gently. And then what we can do, as I keep saying, is we can take the slice tool. So I'm just noticing where I just need to sort of refine and blend out a little bit more with the darkest sepia. And then, as I said, we can take the slice tool and what we're going to do is just focus mostly on creating these little sort of like tiny hair strokes. We can see down here first of all. So I'm just going to draw. I have to hold this quite close, but hopefully you can see that still. Because I need to use not a lot of pressure, but just the right amount to kind of create a bit more of the texture and the detail. So again, we're just going to focus on building up here and over here. Just creating a little bit of texture into these darker parts. Just lightly go over. And then we can again just come back in over this side and just build a little bit more of the texture by just scratching gently. Don't want to press too hard because we don't want to sort of damage the paper. But you can just add a little bit more of the detail. And again, just keep sort of, all I'm doing is tiny little pencil strokes just to allow me to create a little bit more texture. And then lastly, I'm just going to take some more of, well, I don't think I've used this yet, but a little bit of the Payne's Grey from the Polychromos and just running it over some of those sort of cooler, darker areas as well. And just to help build up a little bit more of that cooler blue tone, but again, very, very gently and lightly. We don't want to make this too dark. And then the only other thing you could do would be maybe add a little bit of the Museum Aquarelle white, and then I'm just going to glaze this or push this into those lightest areas and just use it as almost like a little bit of a kind of transition, just really emphasising those lighter areas and using it to kind of smooth any of the cooler areas down a little bit more. Because naturally when we go in with a bit of white, it tends to make areas look a little bit on the cooler side. So I'm only placing this really where I can see it's got a little bit of a cooler tone, light cooler tone. Okay, so apart from a little bit of refining here and there, I think I'm pretty much there with this one. Now, obviously, as I said, we are mimicking a reference photo. We are not a camera. We won't be able to get absolutely every single bit of detail in unless you want to spend about 30, 40, 50 hours working on this and really sort of like working it in. But a lot of us, when we're working on pet portraits, I mean, if we were working on a pet portrait of this size, the dog, excuse me, would be absolutely massive. So the chances are you would never ever be able to get this much detail in on a commission anyway. So, but the whole point of obviously teaching this and us doing this class together is to show you the techniques that I use to create contrast and depth to a highly contrasted and shadowed area, and also one with a lot of detail, and focusing on way more on the shadows and also putting enough depth in, but choosing colours that really complement each other, that are so contrasting, that make this piece just pop off the paper. So I really hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned a lot along the way. My Facebook colour pencil mastermind group will be down below, as I would absolutely love to see your versions of this one. So please either tag me on social media or yeah, just pop them in the Facebook group. If anyone's got any questions or anything at all, just drop me a comment below or send me an email or DM or whichever, whatever. But thank you so much for joining me here today. I really hope you have enjoyed this as much as I have had so much fun filming this, and I do apologise obviously about the dog snoring in the background, and hopefully I'll see you very soon.